Hi, I'm Ryan Szymanski, Director of Curatorial and Educational Affairs for Battleship New Jersey Museum and Memorial.
And I'm Libby Jones, the Education Manager for the Battleship.
Today we're going to be talking, first we'll talk about some of the museum ships that are preserved today. Then we'll go into a general history of cruisers. And finally we'll have some reading and watching recommendations for you at the end of the video. Anything else we need to talk about?
We'll see how it goes.
Yeah.
So first up, museum ships that are cruisers. Olympia?
Olympia is the oldest cruiser that is a museum. They're still on winter hours or still closed for the winter, so they haven't opened yet. And finally, we have USS Salem, which is
on weekends.
Maybe just open on weekends. There's also the Russian cruiser Aurora and the Greek cruiser Averov that are museum ships.
While we're talking about museum ships and who's open, Alabama has officially closed as well. So we're down to one battleship left open.
North Carolina?
North Carolina. Massachusetts is still open on weekends.
Massachusetts on weekends.
Yes.
Ooh, so everybody's gone to reduced hours of some sort.
Massachusetts was only open on weekends this time of year anyway.
Right.
Very far north.
Right, but their winter hours were supposed to have ended, and they extended it out.
Yes. Okay. Well, so we sort of have one left, though. Last man standing. So, cruisers. Where do cruisers begin?
All right, so battleships come from the line of battleships, the sailing ships that would form the line of battle. They were slow-moving, heavily protected, and would just get in parallel lines and slug it out with each other. They required smaller, faster ships to run signals, run orders, do commerce raiding, all sorts of other things. So in the age of sail, those types of ships, which were nicknamed cruisers, were called corvettes, sloops of wars, frigates, and they're more or less equivalent to heavy and light cruisers, with frigates being heavier and sloops and corvettes being lighter with a single deck of guns. Today, the sloop of war Constellation is still open as a museum, as is the frigate Constitution.
Open during normal circumstances, but not right now.
Both are closed currently. There are also some examples of frigates in Europe, with a couple in the United Kingdom. I'm not sure how the museums over there are making out.
Things haven't been looking good.
Yeah.
So
the age of steel comes around, and the line of battleship becomes the pre-dreadnought battleship, and the smaller, faster cruisers become either protected cruisers, which are largely unarmored, except that oftentimes they would have a curved turtle deck protecting their engineering spaces and magazines. That would be a ship like Olympia. And armored cruisers. Armored cruisers were armored to the same scale as battleships, in that they had armor covering most of the ship, and it was designed to protect against their own caliber guns. In this instance, whereas the typical battleship of the era would have 11 or 12-inch guns, the typical armored cruiser would have 8-inch guns, and the typical protected cruiser would have 6-inch guns.
Can you give us a sense of scale?
Ships.
Okay.
I don't have any models for comparing a pre-dreadnought and a cruiser, but typically cruisers are considerably less displacement and considerably narrower for higher speed, but oftentimes their length will be similar to the smallest of battleships. So as we start switching to steam turbines and the speed of now dreadnought battleships start getting faster, older cruisers become obsolete. So a new generation of cruisers is developed. The protected cruiser gives way to the light armored cruiser, which has armor plating everywhere that can protect it against really small guns, but nothing big. And the armored when dreadnought came around. I believe it was 1908, 1909 when Invincible is commissioned as the first battle cruiser, and battle cruisers replaced the armored cruisers as the fast version of the battle line. those which were on independent stations around the world, isolated from the main battle fleets, do commerce raiding and commerce protection duties. And you get a couple of big battles in Coronel and the Falklands. So let's see. Invincible is commissioned 1909. Perfect. Let's see.
So we're working our way into the Washington Naval Treaty and that's impact. What does it do to cruisers?
All right, so we come back to the Washington Naval Treaty. And while it limits the number and size of ships and aircraft carriers, it only limits the size of cruisers. So new cruiser construction is limited to 10,000 ton standard displacement and 8-inch main caliber guns. This is based off of the British Hawkins class cruisers, which were being built right at the end of the war. So the United States was building a light cruiser that could compete with Hawkins. They were designing a ship like that. And so the limitations that they imposed for that, our light cruiser became the USS Pensacola, armed with 10 8-inch guns at about 9,000 ton standard displacement and virtually no armor plating. She was nicknamed a tin-clad instead of an ironclad. And she was the first of a new generation of cruisers. Now, initially, these were all numbered as light cruisers, but in 1930, the London Naval Treaty codified that 10,000 ton cruisers with 8-inch guns were heavy cruisers, 10,000 ton cruisers with 6-inch guns were light cruisers. So that codification stays on through really the rest of the gunfighting cruiser era. If it's got bigger than 6-inch guns, it's a heavy cruiser. If it's got lighter than 6-inch guns, it's a light cruiser. So I do have here a 1700 model of Indianapolis, which is an 8-inch armed heavy cruiser of the tin-clad treaty variety. And here is a 107, just a little bit smaller than Arizona, but much narrower. Whereas Arizona is over 30,000 tons displacement, Indianapolis is down around 10,000 tons. Indianapolis has 9 8-inch guns and 8 5-inch guns. Arizona has 12 14-inch guns and 18 5-inch guns. You can also see that the Indianapolis has much larger propellers than the Arizona. So this is designed to be a much faster ship. She has 2 smokestacks, which means more engineering spaces compared to Arizona's 1. So speed and light armor versus firepower and armor.
Do you know their speeds?
Arizona's speed was 21 knots, and Indianapolis' speed was about 32 knots. Well, let's compare at the end of Indianapolis's career. This is USS New Jersey, fast battleship, also in 1/700 scale. So here you can see a ship designed 10 years later. It's much longer. Still, the battleship is wider. The propeller disparity is less noticeable. The speed disparity is gone. All right.
So World War II cruisers, who are some of our highlights? Say the Indianapolis. She's always one of my favorites. So can you tell us her story?
She was outside of Pearl Harbor conducting gunnery trials around Johnston Atoll at the time of the attack. She searched for Japanese carriers in vain at that time, didn't find any, came back, joined carrier task forces. The aircraft carriers were the fast striking part of the Navy at that point, so the cruisers escorted them. Fought through a number of the battles with that. She probably did some shore bombardment, as did most of these cruisers. For a period of time, she was Admiral Spruance's flagship of Fifth Fleet, a duty which USS New Jersey also shared at other times. At the end of the war, she went to Mare Island for a huge the atomic bombs were loaded on her. She took them out to Tinian, where the aircraft would be launched from. so that they could be put together. And then she was making her way to the Philippines, where the American fleet assembling for the invasion of Japan was. There were some communication errors, and people in the receiving end didn't know they were supposed to expect her. And the people from where she departed didn't know that she was missing. She gets torpedoed by a Japanese submarine because she was sailing unescorted at night and not zigzagging. Sinks pretty immediately, and her crew is in the water for 4 or 5 days before they're discovered and rescued. So even though is in shark-infested water to be rescued.
There's a pretty famous movie referencing that, isn't there?
Yes. Mission of the Sharks. And there was one more recently with Nicolas Cage in it, but I've never seen that one.
It was called Indianapolis.
Called Indianapolis. All right. And that one, I believe, is filmed on USS Alabama, just like the movie Under Sea.
I seem to remember, though, that one of the characters in Jaws also makes a lot of references to it, doesn't he?
Oh, yeah. Quinn in Jaws tells the story, with a little bit inaccurate numbers, of the loss of the Indianapolis. And his whole drive for hunting sharks comes from being in the water after the Indianapolis sank.
Any good book references on the Indianapolis while we're here in the library?
Read, not ones I have read. Well,
we'll stay tuned there, and we'll post up on our Facebook a little bit later some of Ryan's suggestions while he comes up with an answer for that.
Yeah, but if you Google Indianapolis, you're going to get 4 or 5 different book titles that are out there, some of which are in print now, some of which aren't.
Any other famous cruisers?
Another famous cruiser on the Axis side would be the Admiral Graf Spee, which was nicknamed by the Allies a pocket battleship. She did some commerce raiding early in the war, in 1939, before she was finally captured by Commodore Harwood's squadron, caught by Admiral Harwood's squadron off the coast of South America, damaged Exeter, Ajax, and Achilles, but was herself damaged in response, made it into the neutral port of Uruguay, and then ended up scuttling in the River Plate. And there's a movie about her, an old black and white film. Was that called River Plate, or was it called Graf Spee? It's been,
I think it was River Plate.
Called River Plate. It's been
so.
2 decades since I've watched that one. That was filmed on an American cruiser. I believe it was Des Moines, although it might have been Salem. One of those really late generation American heavy cruisers. Other movies filmed on cruisers in yesterday. What else?
There are other famous cruisers we can talk about. We haven't given too much information on the different exploits of Olympia. She's sort of one of our favorites, being just across the river from us. We can see her from the ship. And I just discovered yesterday, I didn't know, that Olympia was there for some of the sinking of ships like BB-16. Our folks at ISM sent us a picture.
I don't think she was there when BB-16 was sunk, but she was there when Billy Mitchell sank the captured German battleship Ostfriesland a little bit earlier on. That's one of the tests that proved that air power could sink a battleship, albeit one that was unmanned, had no damage control going on, and was stationary.
Well, they would learn a few years later that they really were capable of sinking battleships, so...
They were capable of sinking battleships exactly when they first managed to sink underway battleships, which was in December 1941, right after the attack on Pearl Harbor. They were not capable before that.
So what else can you tell us about Olympia?
About Olympia, Olympia's design is very similar to the first 6 frigates of the Navy, where we wanted to build a ship that was, even though she was a protected cruiser, she was designed with really high speed, and she was designed with a main battery of 8-inch guns, which was a little bit larger. The U.S. Navy went away from the concept of ocean-going cruisers for commerce raiding and coastal self-defense battleships, and transitioned into an ocean-going fleet, preparatory to taking a number of overseas colonies. Olympia was critical in taking overseas colonies because during the Spanish-American War, she was the flagship of Admiral Dewey and the American Asiatic Squadron, with an unknown soldier back from France.
So what happens after World War II? Do we still have cruisers? We don't have battleships anymore. Well, we have battleships after World War II, but we don't have battleships today. Do we still have cruisers in the 20th and 21st centuries?
So the role of cruisers became more important during World War II. In World War I, everybody had modern dreadnought battleships. They also had obsolete pre-dreadnought battleships. So if you had a mission where you didn't want to throw away a modern battleship, you'd send in an older pre-dreadnought to do the dangerous tasks. And many of those were sunk, especially in the Mediterranean. In World War II, the Washington Naval Treaty had made everyone get rid of their obsolete battleships. So the 10,000-ton cruiser was the disposable replacement for a capital ship. And so you see a number of battles in which ships like that are thrown in to the breach, especially around Guadalcanal, again in the Mediterranean, with commerce raiding in the Atlantic. So in a number of missions in which there wasn't a great chance of survivability. But their speed proved their worth in being able to get from one conflict zone to another really quickly and escort the carrier strike groups that were the main part of the Navy at that point, the main offensive arm of the Navy. So in a post-World War II world, as the batteries, a cruiser is much cheaper than a battleship. So even when you needed shore bombardment or surface gunfire, the Navy still preferred to go with its old heavy cruisers with their 8-inch guns rather than reactivating a 16-inch armed Iowa-class battleship. There were a couple of occasions where this happened, but by and large, the battleships were in very small numbers in very limited areas, and the cruisers were still doing the lion's share of the work. Nowadays, there are only a handful of cruisers left in the world. The United States has a dozen or so of their Ticonderoga-class cruisers left, and they're looking at end of life for those ships. The Soviet Union has a handful of cruisers left of a couple different classes. And there might still be a South American country that has an old cruiser, but I'm not sure. She might have been decommissioned by now. So cruisers are going the way of the dinosaur themselves because they are now too expensive with their super expensive missile batteries. But destroyers see themselves growing from a very auxiliary small vessel that you could absolutely dispose of. They were nicknamed tin cans, to today where they are basically the modern capital ship of the fleet.
So I got a hot button question for you.
Mm-hmm.
Battle cruisers.
Mm-hmm.
What are they?
We're going to talk about battle cruisers a lot when we do our video on battleships.
Okay.
But here is my 1/700 scale model of HMS Hood, often erroneously called a battle cruiser. She's in fact a fast battleship. But we will use her as an example of a battle cruiser for today and compare her to our heavy cruiser again. So battle cruiser, much larger than a heavy cruiser. They have about the same speed. Battle cruisers trade some of their armor plate and a little bit of firepower. Battle cruiser always has one less turret or one less barrel per turret than the corresponding year's battleship design. And they trade their armor and lengthen the ship. You also have to lengthen the armor belt, protecting the engineering spaces and magazines for the ship. And battle cruisers have the same caliber compared to the 6 or 8-inch guns of most cruisers.
So battle cruisers, you put more into the category with battleships, right? But with battleships, there's just battleships. So why are these not?
Battleships are all, that would be your equivalent of light cruisers and heavy cruisers, and then missile cruisers having their own designs and operating. And you can also throw coastal defense type ships into that as a smaller version of battleships.
So we haven't talked about them at all, but we're going to save that for Battleships Day?
Yeah. Battleships Day, we'll talk about monitors, pre-dreadnoughts, battle cruisers.
And I believe we picked out Battleship Day for Saturday, so stay tuned. That should be 2 episodes from now. So
Destroyers tomorrow. Have we talked about carriers yet?
Yeah, we did carriers. That was day one.
Day one was carriers. Okay.
Yep. It's been a long.
One of my favorite books on cruisers is Friedman's U.S. Cruiser Illustrated Design History. If you've got an extra $150 or so to spend on that, it is a great reference that talks about how those ships grew over time. Let's see. Treaty Cruisers here.
Teach you all about it.
Neptune's Inferno by Hornfisher is also a great book that focuses a lot on the cruisers that the United States and cruiser warfare going on there. And anytime you get a chance to read a Hornfisher book, go for it.
Another one by him, Ship of Ghosts, about the USS Houston.
Yes, I do not have that one on my shelf, I believe. But yeah, good story about Houston and even more so her crew. The first third of the book is about the ship and, spoiler, her eventual loss. And the back 2/3 is about her crew surviving internment in Japanese POW camps.
So while we've got a moment, I want to make a special shout out to those of you who left us comments and questions over the last few days. Please keep sending them in. We want to answer your things for you. Someone specifically said that they're looking forward to hearing more about New Jersey. So we just want to let you know we're giving you a little bit of context on what makes a battleship by telling you what the other kinds of ships are first. And then trust me, we have plenty.
Those, rather than filming live from my library, we were able to film them on site and show you different aspects of the ship.
We're also are posting every day the deck logs of the ship from 1944. It's the ones that we've got access to here. So if you want to hear about what New Jersey's doing every day, you can read her actual accounts. So stay tuned for those. Those are being put out on Facebook and our Twitter page. And we're also doing daily kids activities. So look for those as well every day. Anything else you have to share?
Ship store.
Yes, and don't forget that the ship store is still open online. So if you go to our website, go to the ship store. We'll be sending out things. They've got fun toys to play with while you're stuck inside your house, including puzzles and models. We know that Ryan is a model guy. Maybe you are too. Well, make sure to join us tomorrow then. We'll be doing this every day, somewhere noon, 1 o'clock, somewhere in that ballpark every day. Stay tuned on our Facebook for exactly what time we're going to be doing it. And we will see you tomorrow. Don't forget to leave your comments and questions. That way we can answer those too.